exam because I finished grading last weekend, but I didn't actually go over it with you guys. So if I forget, please remind me. Let's see, we finish at 120. So let's break it like 105 or so. Let's give it a full 15 minutes so we can go over the whole thing. And like I said, we'll actually have a lot of time to talk about Fatima. It's a big book. We'll be reading a lot of it, but we'll be talking about it for the whole rest of the semester. So if we get behind, it's totally fine. This is what we talked about last time. We had some good conversations. It's sort of a difficult subject to teach, right? This book is new. It just came out in 2020. Again, it's called Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent. You guys already know that. Isabel Wilkerson. It's dealing with difficult, complicated issues, but important ones, right? Important ones for American society right now, right? And really the whole history of American society. And it's bigger than just America, right? We talk about India, we even talk about Germany, and then kind of see how these parallel each other. One question I don't know if we've ever answered is, what is the cost of caste? And that's something we started to answer last time, right? We had the twice born. Remember twice born? What does twice born mean? That was the story we covered at the beginning of last time. We talked about shedding the thread. Remember, shed the thread? It's a very kind of catchy, I feel like that'd be a good hashtag or something, right? Shed the thread. So what is the thread? What is twice born? What's that all talking about? You guys remember? I guess I could have put that on the slide, but I did not because I wanted to keep this sort of brief so we can actually get to this book. But it is important information because actually, whether you realize it or not, caste is going to show up throughout this book too. So that could be a very good paper subject. I almost certainly will suggest it. Is I'll say, hey, talk about caste in this book. You know, I'll make it a little more detailed than that, but that's something you can look for. So before we move into this book, let's finish talking about caste. So what is twice born? Ceremony where someone is born again. Yeah. They put ceremonial thread around their neck. Exactly. So the thread basically marks the difference between a high caste person and a low caste person. Like Mario is saying, only the high caste people are born again, are born into this category of twice born. It's the Brahmins, the very highest ones, also the nobility, and the Vaishya too. So those three sort of polite society, we could say it's the upper class priests, or sorry, upper caste priests, upper caste nobility, and then even sort of the upper middle caste people, you know, to use a funny term, upper middle caste. All of them would be called twice born because they've gone through this ritual. And in case you can't tell from looking at them, and you generally cannot in India, you cannot tell somebody's caste from looking at their skin at least, they would be wearing this thread to mark themselves as higher caste. And so then we read a story about someone who sheds the thread, and why? It's basically because of this cost of caste, this feeling like it's all built on a lie, right? Because nobody is actually truly scientifically, let's say, better than anybody else. No one is higher than anyone else. All this stuff about purity and pollution is all a construction, right? It's something we create. It doesn't mean it doesn't affect our lives. It does affect our lives, but at the same time, it's something that we make, right? So what is the cost of this caste system? Well, it's kind of isolation and fragmentation. Do you guys ever feel isolated from the rest of society? That question almost feels rhetorical at this point with COVID and everything, but it's something I actually am genuinely curious about. Do you ever feel isolated, or do you guys not really feel that way?
Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm. So Lauren's saying there are different kinds of isolation in American society, and I think that's true. I think it was Simone, if I recognize her voice, just said, yeah, for sure. Maybe one way to think about this is, do you know your neighbors? And I can just share with you, I do not know my neighbors. I know what it sounds like when they play the violin. I know many other intimate things about them that I probably shouldn't share in class, that I really don't want to know myself. I know that the people upstairs have a kid who bangs the floor very loudly at very early hours of the morning. I know when they're vacuuming. So as you can tell, I can hear a lot about my neighbors. I don't know their names. And I'm not proud of that. You know, that's just the nature of the, my living situation is I'm surrounded by these apartments filled with people that I don't really know anything about. I might see them when I'm off to do my laundry. That's sort of this communal moment, right? But in the end, I am isolated from them, right? At least socially speaking. Maybe I'll hold the door for them. Maybe I'll give them a polite nod if I walk by them in the hallway or something. But I don't really know my neighbor. Do you guys know your neighbors? Yeah. So again, there are different experiences of isolation in this world of ours. And the only reason I bring up this neighbor thing is you might think, but what does that have to do with caste? And I think it actually has a lot to do with caste, right? This separation of people allows us to live different lives. If we're more intimately involved with each other, then we will be living the same lives, right? And so in order to exist in a caste system, we need this separation, right? What does the thread do? Is it separates the higher people from the lower people. If the higher people have more things, live a more comfortable life, they don't have to feel guilty about being separated from the lower people because that's how it should be, right? So anyways, this idea of an isolated and fragmented society, this is my language, but I think it's actually something true. If you look around, we live in a very isolated place. It doesn't mean there are no subcultures, sub-communities, right? I go and play Frisbee. I can see all my friends there on the subway. You just try not to make eye contact, right? And as a result, there's also kind of a lack of cooperation. Would you say that we have problems with cooperation in American society? Well, I'm leaving it open, but in terms of just social programs, let's think about where does cooperation either work or not work in America. We could think about corporate culture. You guys don't have much experience with that. We could think about waiting in line to get something, to get on a train, to buy something at the store. We could think about the vaccine rollout, right? And what sort of structures are in place for cooperation. And I don't mean to imply that we have absolutely no cooperation. I think we do. But also, it's important to think about where this cooperation comes from. Isa says college. What makes you say college, Isa? Where does cooperation come in college? You guys ever have to do group projects? How do you feel about group projects? Not good? Why not?
You have to trust someone else, especially now, like doing a group project that's like you don't see the other person.
Mm-hmm.
You have to like email them like,
Did you?
do the work and actually like submit it. Like your grade depends on that.
Right. Right. That's a lot of pressure. Yeah. So if you couldn't hear, Lauren was reflecting. Now it's hard. It's a hard time to be doing group projects because you rely on each other, you depend on each other, and this is and I agree with this, an inherently kind of unreliable semester, right? Where people have unreliable internet, have unreliable life situations, and again, it's no fault of their own. Sometimes it's their fault, but a lot of the time, no fault of their own. Weirdest stuff is happening all over the country right now, right? And people are kind of unreliable. Isa says projects, also with passing classes and studying. Yeah, the way I want to stress this point. It doesn't have to be, college does not have to be structured in a way where you get an individual grade which reflects your individual pursuits and your individual performance. It is designed this way, right? I could give the whole class a grade, the same grade, right, based on the whole class's performance. But that's kind of contrary to our cultural values, right? We want to separate ourselves out and say, this is my individual performance. This is my individual achievement. This will go on my individual report card for my individual permanent record. And it will help me get me my individual job and will define my individual class one day, right? Maybe not caste, but class. So again, this is just, it's how we make our lives. And in the end, like Lauren is saying, things like cooperation do sort of fall to the background. I'm not here to say it never happens. We do cooperate, especially when it's in our own shared interests, right? If we all have an interest, a reason to cooperate, but it's not maybe a strong point in American culture. And I would argue that's a big reason why we fumbled this whole COVID thing, is because we weren't able to cooperate when we needed to do it the most. Now, does this all go back to caste? I think in a way it kind of does, honestly, but it's a little more subtle than that, right? It's hard to draw the lines of why we don't want to cooperate. It's just sort of in our bones here in America. And what Wilkerson argues is we need empathy. You guys have probably heard this word before. Have you heard this word before? It's sort of, I hate to say it, it's sort of a disappointing conclusion. I think she can do a little better than that, but it's also like, you can't hate it either, right? Empathy is a good thing. What is empathy? Does anybody want to define empathy for us? So especially the heart is the last frontier. Maybe you remember that example. Both, I guess we can talk about these two. Both of these were sort of subtle stories about caste, right? Isa says, isn't it like being able to put yourself in others' shoes? Yeah, that's a good way to think about it, right? So rather than drawing a line between ourselves and others, right, keeping this thread around my body and saying, I am different from you, it is shedding that thread and saying, we are actually kind of the same. And again, this is shoved down your throat your whole lives, right? So that's why I find this a little bit disappointing. I think the empathy really needs to come on an institutional level where, again, we kind of cooperate institutionally, we take care of each other institutionally, and we don't have cops like spilling John's drink all over his seat. At least worse things have happened in the last week, let's just say, when cars are getting pulled over. And so, yeah, where does the empathy need to come from? Yeah, it's on an individual level, but I'm not going to point the finger at you and say you need to be more empathetic. I think that's actually we've tried that, right? And it hasn't really quite worked. It needs to be a bit bigger than that. We need something a little more systemic is perhaps a word you've heard before. So what would systemic empathy look like? Well, it's almost hard to imagine, right? I think it is stuff like grading the entire class and forcing people to work together and care about each other, which again is like totally anathema. Do you guys know this word? Anathema. It's the total opposite of the way we usually feel. And I don't know if that will ever happen in America because it's so deeply ingrained in us. I'm realizing my role in this, in fact, is cracking the whip and getting you guys to work hard and threatening you with grades and all this sort of stuff. You take that away, what do we even have anymore? It's a little even hard to imagine. So what does Wilkerson say? We need to recognize that we are in need of one another more than we have been led to believe, right? And again, more group projects might force you to realize that, but as Lauren said, it's sort of an uncomfortable solution at the same time. So as you can tell, I don't give the group projects because I remember being a student and kind of hating them myself. So any other thoughts on what we talked about last time, these stories or anything? One thing we talked about too is racism and how that's sort of this really extreme word. I watched, do you guys know John Oliver last week tonight? You guys ever watch him? I watched the John Oliver thing where he talked about Tucker Carlson, right? It's almost like, it's this funny thing where there's like the parts on two different teams, right? If you watch Fox News, maybe Tucker Carlson makes fun of John Oliver, I'm not sure. And then if you watch John Oliver, he's making fun of Fox News all the time. And so it's almost like two parallel figures who just like to make fun of each other. But a big part of his talk is what is white supremacy? It made me think of the conversation we had, which is what is racism, right? And if it's this really extreme idea of like burning crosses and hating people for the way they look, that kind of gets lost in most people's day-to-day experiences. And I think what these stories show is this language of caste allows us to pick up on a little more subtlety, right? These more subtle lines that we draw between ourselves and other people, even when we don't want to, right? Even when I'm not thinking, I am racist, I am better, I am different than everybody else, we still might have this feeling like, but I am kind of different, right? I'm a different race than that person, and therefore they're sort of different from me. It doesn't even have to be a feeling of hate or exclusion or discrimination. But sometimes if I'm a busy waiter trying to take care of a bunch of people, I'll just be drawn to the ones that are more like me, right? The ones that I identify with more. And so we have this sort of grumpy plumber. Maybe he was lazy, maybe he's having a bad day, or maybe, again, he was working within this caste system, which Wilkerson has really very nicely argued that we are all a part of, right? And so I think it allows us to see these more subtle layers. We could call it of racism that makes you uncomfortable. We could call it caste, right? I think that's, again, the power of this book by Wilkerson is she opens up the door. She gives us the language to talk about these more subtle differentiations that we create for ourselves. Okay, thoughts from last time? Again, we ran out of time, so I don't want to cut anyone off. But if there are no thoughts, we can continue. So some kind of interesting thinkers. I just pulled out 3 famous people that maybe you have or have not heard of. Hannah Arendt, have you heard of her before? She's a philosopher. As you can see, she died a pretty long time ago. She has this nice term, the banality of evil. Have you heard of banality before? What is banality? This is a good word to look up. You'll see this again, and you'll be tempted to pronounce it wrong. The adjective is banal, which looks like another word, but it's pronounced very differently. It's banal. Banal, banality, banal. So what is banality? It's boring, actually. It's normal. What does it say? Factor or condition of being banal, unoriginality. So I guess we have to look up banal, something that is banal. So let's look up banal. You guys ever do this? So lacking in originality as to be obvious and boring. Yeah, boring. So it's just another word for boring, kind of a fancy word for boring. Rather than write boringness, you can write banality. So again, this is college. We're learning good words here. So what do you think the banality of evil is talking about? And I'll give you a clue. Hannah Arendt was, I believe she was born in Germany. I could be wrong, somewhere that Germans affected, and she was Jewish. And if you look at the dates during which she was alive, that's very important information, right? So what do you think she's talking about when she talks about the banality of evil? Nazi Germany. Yeah, so how is Nazi Germany banal? That's a weird word to use to describe Nazi Germany, isn't it?
Because like that ideology normalized in the country
Mm-hmm.
where it was like, because everyone like kind of thinks that like that type of evil is something that was so extreme and like how did people like took over or like it was like an ideology that got planted into people that believed it over time, so it got more and more dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
Like it was dangerous from the start, but like it just started like normal and
Mm-hmm.
boring.
Boring transgressions. Yeah. So if you couldn't hear, what Lauren was talking about is how we are tempted to think of Nazi Germany as this really extreme thing that was forced upon the world and then was taken away from the world, right? That's often how it's described. We were all very nice people in the early 20th century, right? The whole world was happy and fine, and then the Nazis came and they were very bad, but it was just for a little while. Then we took them away again. And everything was happy and fine again, right? Obviously, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but that is not how things really went, right? Nazi Germany grew from this banality of evil, right? It grew from that, let's call roots that were not even limited to Nazi Germany, right? I think have we talked explicitly about eugenics before? Eugenics, has anybody heard of that? What is eugenics? Or what are eugenics? Is that plural? It's probably plural. Eugenics, what's that talking about?
Also, the whole banality that is it related also to internalized racism?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So internalized racism is sort of a new way of expressing an old idea. Yeah. So I think that's exactly what Hannah Arendt is getting at. Eugenics. We can look it up together. Eugenics. See, I'm not forcing you guys to look things up. If it were normal class, I would torture you more. Oh, this is so long. I don't know if we want to read this, but yeah, we can read the beginning part. How to arrange reproduction within a human population to increase occurrence of heritable characteristics regarded as desirable. Maybe that's enough. But then the Nazis sort of take it up and they, made this kind of their main creed, right? You can read the Wikipedia page later. We don't have to look at that. But again, it's this idea that there are biological characteristics that are more desirable than other biological characteristics. So maybe you've heard of highbrow and lowbrow humor. Have you ever heard of that before? Have you heard of that before? Heard of it? Highbrow. What does highbrow mean? Fancy. I've never thought about it like that either. I learned this relatively recently. I think maybe on Twitter or something, but it kind of blew my mind when I read it. I was like, oh, highbrow is referring to the place where your eyebrows are. It's referring to the relationship between your hairline and your eyebrows. People with higher brows, a longer face, we could say, are thought of as being more fancy. Higher caste, we could say. Lowbrow people are lower caste. Now, of course, that is not a meaningful term for us anymore, but it's even instilled in our language. We still say that, right? We still refer to these physical characteristics to define caste, which is literally what that is doing. So to pretend like the Nazis came out from somewhere out of left field and had nothing to do with the society of the world, right? Not even just Germany, but of the world, including America. You guys probably already know this, but there were major Nazi supporters in America in the 30s, right before we went to war with them. To assume that this was somehow evil and outside of our normal daily experience is just a gross mischaracterization of what was actually happening. So you've probably read this Wilkerson thing by now. It's been up here long enough, but Wilkerson is basically just saying this is part of all of us, right? And to pretend like it's not is just trying to wash your hands clean of something, frankly, they are not clean, right? It is important to recognize our what did Simone just say? Our implicit racism, right? Was that what it was? Internalized racism, right? The way in which
internalized racism.
Internalized racism. The way in which these structures actually do take a hold of us. Using the word racism might set people off. They'll say, "I'm not racist. I'm not a Nazi." I mean, some people are, but most people are not, right? But again, this language of caste, I think, makes it a little bit softer, and says, yeah, you're not a Nazi. You are not racist, according to that really extreme definition. But there are these lines that we draw, and I think that's undeniable. Especially if you examine your own life. You will see them in your own life, right? I encourage you to look. Ambedkar, he's an Indian thinker from the early 20th century. He says caste is a notion. It is a state of the mind, right? As opposed to a biological reality, right? And again, this is something we talked about last time. Race, we could just take caste out and put race in there. It is also a notion. It is a state of the mind. Again, we said there are some biological realities, right? The pigment of the skin is biologically different, but 99, I'm going to even go out and say 0.9, I don't know if that's true, but let's just say 99% of our biological reality is 100% the same. 99% is 100%. No, I'm confusing you now. A vast majority, 99% of our genes, right, are the same. They're just these minor little mutations that are different that 23andMe tracks, and then little things about what is it called? Melanin, right? The production of pigments in our skin, minor things about the way our eyes and faces are composed. But vast majority, our guts, our blood, our structures, they're all the same, right? And the things that we attach to it, it's all just in your mind, right? It doesn't mean it's not important in our lives, but it does mean that we create these things. No one escapes it. Finally, here's a smart guy, right? When he came to the United States, maybe I'll read this quote. So Albert Einstein, he says, "We must make every effort to ensure that the past injustice, violence, and economic discrimination will be made known to the people. The taboo, the let's not talk about it, must be broken." And of course, that's what we're doing now, right, in this class. To pretend like this history is not there, the Jim Crow period didn't happen, is something of an injustice, right? Because these histories echo today. They were not that long ago. My parents were born in the 50s, before schools were integrated. My parents were both born in 1956. So their lifetime, the lifetime of one generation ago, saw an incredible change in the structures, the laws of American society. And so what Einstein is saying is we need to remember that, right? I wholeheartedly agree because again, these structures persist in perhaps subtle ways, but persist nonetheless. Have you all heard of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? Is that a thing you've heard of before? I think in the interest of time, let's not open this link. This is a video. But after the apartheid, maybe you have heard of the apartheid. What is the apartheid? It was. Chat, you guys aware of this? Maybe you heard Lauren. But it was a segregation movement in South Africa. Nelson Mandela, right? He's put in jail for resisting apartheid, and then it stopped very recently. So in the early 90s, you guys, I guess, weren't born yet, but it only came to an end in the early 90s, right before you were born, right? When I was a kid, this horrible structure of apartheid finally came to an end. So again, this is very relevant for the world we're in today. And not only Nelson Mandela, but Desmond Tutu. Have you guys heard of him before? Desmond Tutu. He's a religious figure from South Africa. And so he and many others were behind this Truth and Reconciliation Committee, where people who committed crimes, who perpetrated the apartheid, were forced to reckon with their victims, right? It's very powerful, very emotional. People are crying, stories are being told. And again, it's what Einstein's talking about. It's breaking this taboo of let's just sweep it under the rug and hope it goes away, because it does not go away, right? If you just sweep it under the rug, it does not go away. It just kind of festers and stays there. And that's kind of where we're at today. So after this, we will be done with Wilkerson. Any last thoughts on caste? Again, we'll be able to find some of these ideas in this book if you look for them. It's not quite as obvious, but you will be able to find them. Last thoughts on caste? Hopefully this was a helpful conversation. You know, you can remember Hannah Arendt's line, the banality of evil. All right, so here's the new book. Religion and Medicine is kind of the general subject. This is something I actually researched. This is something I care a lot about. And that is why we are turning to it now. So this is a book that is about America. It was published in 1997. It was researched in the 80s, and it's really many years of work. As you can see, it's a very big book. Anne Fadiman is an excellent writer. Have I written her name here? Yeah, Anne Fadiman is the author. She's an excellent writer. It was initially conceived as a story for the New Yorker. You guys read the New Yorker? New Yorker. I'm gonna confess, I don't always read the New Yorker. I read like a handful of articles every month. I always think like I should probably subscribe to the New Yorker, but I don't. I just read the free articles, and then, you know, that's about all I have time for. But if you want to be smart, honestly, if you're like interested in being kind of a smart, generally educated person, read the New Yorker. I think their catchphrase is like the best writing anywhere or something. I forget exactly what it is, but it's true. It's full of really good writers, very clear thinkers, right? A lot of the things I give to you in this class is actually not very well written. It's more for the ideas, for the concepts. But if you want very clear, concise presentation, really like beautiful writing, go to the New Yorker, right? And here is a big example of it. If you like Fadiman, if you like this book, you will probably also like the New Yorker. So it's more like journalism, right? The ideas the research doesn't quite go in as much depth as I would like. I do have some criticisms of this book, but it's very beautifully written. It's a very nice book. So I hope you guys are enjoying it. So maybe something we can start with is we have this cultural idea of caste. We could even say it's a religious idea. We wrote about this a long time ago, but how does religion help create caste? Or maybe you remember that assignment. And then we have this quote unquote biological idea of race, which is also actually cultural, although we kind of pretend like it's not. How does caste show up in medicine? How does caste affect medicine? We've talked about this before, but maybe it's worth putting it into words again. Well, maybe I'll just say, does it affect medicine? And I'm arguing that it does. And if it does, how does caste show up in medicine?
Through bias either through wealth or through racial bias. For wealth bias, like let's say you're on implant list, some people if they have money, and they donate that money or they use their money some way, shape, or form, they can be put high in the list, so they're more likely to receive a transplant before they die. And also, if you need like a life-saving surgery, if you have money, you can afford it, and if you don't have money, then you're gonna end up dying.
Okay.
Racial, it's a lot of racial medical bias in the medical system, such as like some diseases, the way that they appear on white skin differs from the way it appears on dark skin. And in medical school, it's not, they don't teach students how that disease appears on black skin.
Very good. Thank you, Isa. So
Mm.
you covered a lot there.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Simone, please continue.
Oh, just what I was gonna say is I think we might have talked about this before, but there's a lot of myths in the medical field about, for example, actually a lot of like the first studies of gynecology were tested on Black women, and people had thought that Black women could have endured more pain.
Hmm.
And so that caused a lot of neglect in the field of medicine. So it's still, I don't know how present it is today, but there is still, I'm pretty sure there are still things that people consider like they can tolerate more pain, or sorry, that was my alarm. But those kinds of things.
Okay, so I don't know if I'll even be able to touch on everything that Isa and Simone just said, but this is all very good. So Isa got us started with class, right? As opposed to caste, with class, with money. And I think this is undeniable, right? People with more money have access to better healthcare in this country. You guys all agree with me? Are we all on the same page? I think that just is true across the board. And that, you know, has important political connotations. Right now, there are a lot of conversations about what we should do about this situation. And frankly, it's very difficult to fix. This book is about poor people, poor immigrants. And in a lot of ways, that doesn't affect this story very much. I think the gap in terms of access to healthcare has kind of gotten more extreme since the 80s. Things were actually a bit easier at that time. And we'll talk about the details of that. And then the other piece, and this is the more difficult question, is how does, again, we could say internalized racism, how does this caste system, how does this affect the care that people receive in a medical setting? And it's, you know, I want to be careful with my language here. I'm not here to say doctors are racist. I'm not here to say that they're trying to abuse certain patients and help other patients. I don't think that's what's happening. It's almost like the waiter at the restaurant we talked about before. There's some kind of subtle, quiet form of differentiation happening where, like Simone was saying, when giving birth, I think it is again, it's a fact. It's been observed. I couldn't quote any studies for you, but in terms of how much pain medication women get, women of color get less pain medication than white women. And we could discuss why that happens, but I think it has been established that this is a fact. This is a real phenomenon. This is something that really happens. And I think it ties in with these very subtle lines that we draw, right? Certain people might talk about their pain in different ways, and if they're not talking about their pain in a way that the doctor recognizes, then they'll be less likely to give that medication, right? I'm sure it's a very subtle, very difficult reason, but for whatever reason, there's less pain medication being given to women of color. It's something that has been established. So that's a great example, Simone. And again, we will see something like this here too. We are seeing two amazing doctors, and they're really, Ann Fadiman does a great job showing how excellent these doctors are. And yet the care that they give to the patients in this book, it's a little, what to say, it's definitely affected by the fact that the patients are Hmong. I don't know if you know this word, but they are Hmong people. So this is Southeast Asian people that we'll discuss in a moment. We'll talk all about Southeast Asia in a moment. So this is something I want you to look for, right? I think in the 90s, Fadiman didn't really even have the language to discuss it. I think we have more tools now and more awareness of these sorts of phenomena. So I want you to look for it as we read this book. And again, you can write about it. Is this something you would like to write about? Other things, religion and medicine, medical healing versus religious healing. What do you guys think of when you hear that? What's the difference between religious healing and medical healing? Medical healing, we probably all know. We know what medicine is, right? What would religious healing even be? Have you ever heard of something like this before? Mm-hmm. Okay, so what Lauren said is religious healing would be more about somebody's soul, or maybe we could say their spirit or something like that, right? Whereas medical healing is about your body. She used the example of antibodies, but those, of course, are in your body. And so maybe there's this split between body and soul, right? Religion for the soul, medicine for the body. That makes a lot of sense to me. I think that's wonderful. Other thoughts? Does anybody have an example of religious healing that they've either read about, heard about, seen? What is an example of religious healing?
I had one time heard about these people. I don't know if this is a good example, but in Brazil, how these like spiritual surgeons, what they would do is they would do surgery, like from long distance, which is, I mean, it's just something that I had heard about.
I've also heard about it. Yeah, please.
Yeah, that they did like cleansing from a distance, and how it had worked for a lot of people.
Good.
And they had set up these cameras with like I just remember seeing it because it was like in Chile it was very famous for a bit because people had wanted it, but it was very expensive to get it. And it was they just did the surgery from a distance.
There's a This American Life episode about this. I don't know if we'll be able to find it. Yeah, it was probably this one.
From Brazil, yeah.
Yeah. Did they talk about
Yeah.
Brazil? I'll put it in the chat if you guys want to listen to it. We didn't listen to This American Life in this class, but it is an excellent podcast show. Let's see. Entities. Is this the right one though? I'm not even sure. Yeah, Davey Rothbard goes to Brazil with his deaf mother. Yeah, so it's this one. It's pretty interesting stuff. It's an older episode. As I was preparing for this class, I was thinking about using it. It's from 2004, but I thought it was too much of a tangent, so I didn't do it. But yeah, it's an excellent example. It's kind of interesting stuff. It's just like Simone was describing. I don't know if I could do a better job, but there's this healing figure, and they talk about these spirits, and there's a sense you can do this spiritual surgery where they're theoretically like working on you as you're sleeping or something like that. And the journalist who's doing the story, his mom is deaf, and the mom really believes in it, but the son does not really believe in it. So if you're skeptical, then it does a pretty good job of walking that thin line between being skeptical and believing it, because the two characters talk to each other. So anyways, I encourage you checking it out if you're looking for podcasts. If you've never heard This American Life, it's another very smart, very accessible, very entertaining, very well done podcast. And as you can tell, they've been doing it for years. There's like infinite episodes to listen to. It's really pretty amazing. So yeah, that's a great example. Wonderful. So lots of different kinds of religious healing, whether you recognize it or not. Other things could be like going on pilgrimage. Have you ever heard of pilgrimages where you like go to the special place and there are all this pile of crutches that people throw off when they're miraculously healed? So all kinds of examples, laying on hands, right? Even just prayer, right? Praying for somebody who's sick. That would be a religious healing too. So lots of examples of this. We often keep these sort of separate though, right? It's like, okay, there's that stuff. That's kind of, that's one thing. And then there's real medicine on the other hand. And again, this book is playing with that divide, right? It's something we're going to keep thinking about as we read this book. So yeah, that's just all kind of an introduction. Like I said, we will pause to talk about the exam soon. But before we do that, let's take a map quiz. So this is just for fun. I'm not going to actually record these scores because it's very easy to Google them. But don't Google them, right? Test your knowledge. See if you can recognize these countries. So as you can see, they're labeled 1 through 13. So let's do it. So please take out a piece of paper or write on a in a Word document or something like that. Please go through these. We'll just take a few minutes and identify 1 through 13 to the best of your ability, and then we'll go over the answers together. Okay? I'll pause the recording.